hoo, hoo, hoo. Hoo, hoo, hoo. Look at that hair, eh? Okay. What's going on, everybody? How we doing? Monday, December 2nd. Welcome to December. Welcome to December. I hope everyone has had a good long weekend. I guess a long weekend if you're in the US, which I'm not. But with Thanksgiving on Thursday and Black Friday on Friday, and then the weekend, and then Cyber Monday today. I don't think Cyber Monday is a holiday, but I know that most Americans typically take I don't know if Black Friday is actually a holiday, but I think most Americans take the Friday after Thanksgiving off. Actually, in fact, you know what? I think most Americans take the whole week off. You know, it's fucking, the US is the only country where like Thanksgiving, I mean, it's just classic, right? But like Thanksgiving in the US, like no one works that week. Like, you know, people take like 3 days off. Whereas like in Canada, like Thanksgiving is like, we don't even fucking celebrate it, really. We do have one holiday, but just like no one gives a shit. I think that just goes to show the US, you know what I mean? Like, it's why that's why they have Donald Trump running the country, but it's also why they fucking take half a week off on Thanksgiving. You know what I mean? Because the world fucking revolves around it. But anyways, I digress. All right, guys, if you're watching this live, let me know what's up. Let me know that I'm not speaking completely by myself here. If you're watching this live, let me know, you guys. Say hello in the chat section. Tell me your name. And tell me where you are tuning in from in the world. Where are we tuning in from as we're moving into the first live of December? The first live of December. December is the only month in the winter that I don't hate. I don't know how you guys feel, but December's got a good feeling. November, January, February, March. Ooh, that's just fucking brutal. All those months are bad. They're real bad. But December is just like right in the middle. Right in the middle, it's just like everything's okay. You know what I mean? We're just gonna hang by the fire. You know, we got all these different parties. You know, we got just a warm, cozy feeling, bringing family and loved ones together. It's not so bad. But yeah, fucking November, January, February, March. Ooh, I don't think so. Okay, you guys, if you're watching live, let me know. Let me know where you're tuning in from. We're going to talk about ending relational delusions, kind of this idea of killing the relationship fantasy, right? So we're going to talk a lot about living in relational fantasies, living in relational delusions. What does that mean? Where does that come from? How do we begin to be able to sort of heal this aspect of ourselves? So that's what we're going to kind of be exploring today. So if you guys have any questions, if you have anything sort of pertaining to this subject matter, feel free to drop it in the chat section. And if you're watching this replay, then this chat section will not be available. Okay, so ending relational fantasies and delusions, right? So first, just like off the hop, I'm gonna have a sip of my Red Bull, my supersized Red Bull. But off the hop, what I've learned and what I feel is that, you know, in order to really move into sort of this healthy iteration of like what is healthy love, to prepare for sacred union, to be able to move into a space of calling in the relationship that we desire, and to be able to move into a space of healthy relating, one of the biggest aspects that we need to move through is killing this idea of the relationship fantasy. We need to be able to move into a space of discernment. I always say we need to be able to go from the hopeless romantic to the hopeful romantic. So I'm a hopeless romantic. I have been my entire life, ever since I was a little boy, you know, who little girls would plan their weddings. I was that little boy who would plan his wedding. You know what I mean? I would kiss the girl down the block. That was my first kiss. I don't know how old I was. I think I was like 8. But we had this fucking wedding, and I'm pretty sure the wedding was my idea. I'm pretty sure, you know, I was like, I'm marrying you in my backyard, you know, and she just didn't have any sort of say in the matter. So I planned the wedding. I was that dude when I was 8 years old. So It's this idea of going from a hopeless romantic to a hopeful romantic. Because I think we kind of get confused, right? We're like, okay, does that mean I need to be like overly pragmatic and practical about love, and that I'm never able to, have any of these fucking butterflies? I'm never able to look across a crowded room and see that fucking light radiate across their face and be like, yeah, that person. Like, is that what that means? Right. And so this idea of, do we have to lose all, that aspect of us when we were 17, and we're like, I wonder who I'm going to marry one day. I wonder who that person is that I'm going to end up with. And we're like, okay, do we have to kill off all of that part of us? Do we have to kill off every single aspect of ourselves in order to move into a healthy form of relationship? And in order to move into this space of discernment. So like when I say discernment, some people might be like, what do you mean by discernment? So really what I would say, the way that I would sort of break down discernment, is that you're available, your heart's not shut down, you're not closed, but you're able to live in the reality of a connection, right? So discernment, you have healthy boundaries, meaning, sometimes what happens is a connection comes into our life and we completely abandon our own internal boundaries. Think about like the simplest form of discernment would be like this: an internal boundary. Say you're talking to someone in the early days, right? And say your bedtime is like, typically you go to bed at like 11, right? But you're having a good, you've been talking to this person maybe a few weeks. You're having some good sort of, texting, sort of rapport, whatever. And your bedtime comes around and you're tired. You got to get up fucking early. Are you the type of person who sort of self-abandons and self-sabotages a little bit of what you have to do the next day? You have that sort of 11 p.m. bedtime that you usually abide by, so you can fucking get your beauty sleep, you can be ready for the morning, and you sort of self-abandon that internal boundary and want to make yourself just totally available for the connection. You're like, fuck my bedtime. I don't need to worry about that. Then you get up the next morning and you're fucking exhausted and you are a little bit frustrated with yourself. And so now you've sort of begun to sort of build this precedence with yourself that you will abandon your own internal boundaries. So when we talk about boundaries, right? Internal boundaries, external boundaries. Internal boundaries is how we self-abandon, right? How we have our own sort of markers of commitment to ourselves, being in integrity with ourselves. And do we abide by those pillars, or do we kind of overstep ourselves, right? And so you have that bedtime. Do you tell that new connection, hey, it's my bedtime, I got to go to bed, I got to get up early, it was great speaking to you, I look forward to talking to you again? Do you sort of self-honor what that is for you? That's a very sort of micro example of if we're someone who's prone to live in relational fantasy, and that's sort of the archetype, right? That we're what it essentially means is that we're going to be really prone to self-abandon, mean overstep our own internal boundaries, right? So when I think of discernment, which is directly related to ending relational discernments, right? So overstepping boundaries or allowing someone into our space, which obviously, as we know, boundaries are so connected to anger, and then resentment is basically the unprocessed emotion of anger. And so if we're someone who's swayed into relational delusion or relational fantasy, we're not really going to have a strong container of these are my external boundaries and these are my internal boundaries. I would probably go as far to say that our container is not really going to be strong to begin with. We're going to be someone with a pretty loose container, right? And so when I mean a container, I mean some element of structure in what you need to thrive as a human being. So maybe, structure would be what you need to thrive in terms of your health as a human being, what you need in structure to thrive in whatever business you're building or whatever job you have, whatever structure you need to thrive creatively, whatever it is sort of you have set up through your own sort of navigation and execution of what you need to thrive as a human being. When people are really prone to live in relational fantasy or relational delusion, what it means is that we're going to have a really loose container, or that container is going to be really susceptible to swaying or being abandoned. in the name, particularly of love and relationships, right? Love and relationships is the thing that every human being wants the most, which means it's going to hold the most karma. It's also going to hold the most charge, which means it's going to test us the most in terms of how do we self-honor in the experience of charged emotions, of feeling certain things, of feeling different attachment that gets pulled on, right? And so if we're someone who's prone to relational delusion or relational fantasy, and basically, you guys, delusion and fantasy, I'm basically using interchangeably here. But what that means is we're going to have a really loose container, meaning we might not even have a container at all, which is this is sort of like the sovereign space in which we operate and which we need to sort of self-honor to be really successful and to be really fulfilled and whole in whatever it is that we're doing or pursuing in this life. Or we're going to have this container, but it's very easily moldable, right? Maybe we have a strong container. Then as soon as someone comes in the picture, we're like, oh my God, they're fucking hot. I feel a sacral charge. I'm turned on. I'm attracted to them. I like them. Ooh, this could be a possible relationship. And then all bets are off of what happens to our container, right? Again, that 11 p.m. comes around. Do we honor sort of that 11 p.m. bedtime, or do we overstep and talk to this person till 1 a.m. and then we wake up and we're exhausted, right? So this is all dealing with this relational delusion. So one piece that's going to be at the core of this is a lack of foundation, right? So one reason why we might be prone to relational delusion or relational fantasy is because we lack a foundation. And so what I mean by that is energetically, in terms of our sovereignty, we're not rooted and anchored in the earth. We don't have a really, really strong foundation. So I'll give you an example. What this would look like for a man is that he doesn't really have a lot of this masculine foundation. You know what I mean? He's sort of anchored in who he is. He has some type of structure and system set up in his life or whatever he's doing that allows him to feel as this independent, sort of anchored person in the world where he really knows who he is. And then he feels comfortable bringing sort of a feminine energy into that space. And he has some type of establishment through his own sort of energy, his personality, what he's doing and what he's creating that he feels is pretty sovereign and has a certain level of foundation and anchoring and structure into it so that he can bring a feminine energy and she's able to sort of, nestle up to this energy a little bit, right? So that would be an example of a foundation. And so a lot of the times when we're sort of people who are prone to delusion or fantasy, one sign is that we might lack our own sort of internal foundation within ourselves and our life. And what that means is we're really going to be using relationships as this sort of holy grail or this be all to end all or this really sort of shining, shimmering light, right? You know, those types of people where it doesn't really matter about what's going on in our life. Like all we really care about is either our current relationship or finding a relationship. You know, a lot of people like that, right? Where all we really care about, we're newly single from a fucking relationship and immediately we're swiping in the apps. Immediately we're like, okay, I got to find someone else. Maybe we have a couple months, but immediately we're trying to find someone else. And so there's something relationally that holds this weight in our life that we sort of see this relationship as this savior for something, right? Whether this relationship will allow us to feel whole. So a lot of the times, and what's most common, obviously with things like codependency, is we're actually looking for a relationship to feel whole. Means something really feels like it's missing in our life. And obviously you can have a really, really full life and be like, I would love to have a relationship. If I had a relationship, it would add a lot to my life, right? But it's a real different energy than when you really don't feel whole and you're really, really looking for this relationship to feel whole. You're really searching and seeking for this relationship to be whole. When we're really prone to self-abandon our internal boundaries, allow people to overstep our external boundaries, a big part of that is when we really don't feel whole deeply internally inside of ourselves at some level. And so we're looking for a relationship to feel whole, right? So it'd be a lot of this energy of we just never felt like we belonged. We never felt like we fit in. We always felt like we were flawed. We always felt like there was something wrong with us. There was something defunct with us. And so now our whole lives, we basically live, even just unconsciously, with a relationship can be that ultimate form of approval. If I can find a relationship where someone adores me, someone admires me, someone loves me, someone is able to give me sort of that experience of being wanted, of being desired, then I will suddenly feel whole. And when that's the case, when we're dating from a place of like an internal lack or a lack of wholeness, we're not really going to discern as deeply as we should, right? We're going to be like, okay, yeah, maybe this person. It's going to be an energy where we're not really going to be sort of clear and discerning about it, right? When we think about being discerning or having discernment, it basically means you're open and you're available, but you're really sort of clear. You're really sort of clear in what's going to work for you and what doesn't work for you. And you're actually vetting. You're actually approaching sort of say the vetting process of dating or getting to know someone with like a really, really clear energy field. Meaning you're not leading with your woundedness. You're not leading with neediness. You're not trying to rush this process. Like it actually means that you're like really, really grounded in reality. When we think discernment, it means that we're really, really grounded in reality. Like think about the whole experience, right? Where someone's on like, the third date and and we can get really forward thinking. We can be like, oh my God, like I wonder what our kids would look like. And, if we're a guy, be like, I wonder, her first name with my last name. Does that go together? Does that work? And we've gone on like 3 fucking dates, right? Or say we're fucking building this long distance connection and we're sort of just moving into the space of infatuation and romance and feeling energy that is sort of out of body, right? It's not really, really in reality. So when we think discernment, it really, really means being super, super present to reality, which is like, I've been on 2 dates with this person, I'm just going to see how it goes, right? We're really allowing the unfolding to happen, right? And so often when we're prone to delusion or fantasy, we don't live in unfolding. We live in forward thinking, right? We live in forward thinking. And ultimately, if we think about, okay, like why are we living in forward thinking? Why can't we be really, really present to a relationship? And it's kind of like the energy, you guys, like, when you could be talking to someone or getting to know someone and you feel like they're moving so much into your space. When we think about someone's energy being really, really sovereign, like they really feel rooted in who they are. Even if you're talking to them, getting to know them, they really feel in their own energy space. Like their energy is back in their space. It's back here. And they're really rooting themselves. They're really anchoring themselves. They're not kind of moving forward like this. And when we're prone to relational delusion or fantasy, we're not pulling from like this sovereign, embodied, living in my root sort of connection. It's about higher frequency, right? Relational fantasy is basically we're addicted to higher frequency relationship, right? Relational delusion, relational fantasy, we're addicted to higher frequency forms of relating. You know what I mean? The idea where like, oh my God, we have this crazy soul connection, or we have this crazy spiritual connection, or I feel this sort of energy. And so we feel these higher frequency feelings, but we either we lose the anchoring and the rooting, or we never had it to begin with, right? And so a lot of the time, people who are really prone to forward thinking relationally, relational fantasies, relational woundedness, what they lack is they lack like a rooting and an anchoring in themselves. And so this is where, as I talk about like foundations, like really building a foundation in your life. Like think about people who are just moving all over the place. They're not anchored. They're not sort of rooted even in who they are in their own nervous system. It's kind of higher frequency energy. If we're in that sort of higher frequency energy, we're going to be a lot more susceptible. We're going to be a lot more prone. Like, think about someone relational fantasy. It's like, we're constantly sort of like this, like, oh my God, this is intriguing. I'll go in this direction. I'll go in this direction. And it's really impulsive, erratic, and quick, right? It's really impulsive, erratic, and quick. So delusion and fantasy, we become really emotionally impulsive, particularly when it comes to romance and love. Um, Basically means we get to know someone, we're committed immediately, right off the hop. We're like, okay, yes, I'm all in with this person immediately, rather than, okay, well, like, fuck, I gotta get to know this person, see if, like, even just vet them as a human being. And so we're really erratic, we're impulsive, and we're quick, right? So a lot of relational delusion, relational fantasy, higher frequency, and the energy needs to drop. The energy needs to drop, which really means we need to become our own sort of anchoring and rooting in the world. And for example, as I use the example, like a man, let's use the example of a man who's prone to relational fantasy. A man who's prone to relational fantasy, first off, has probably got a really strong mother wound. A man who's prone to relational fantasies probably got a really strong mother wound. And he's looking for some form of unconditional love in the feminine that he never feels like he received or never felt consistent for him. And so, with men who live in fantasy, probably what they lack is a deep masculine sort of foundation in their own energetic sovereignty, where they feel really clear on who they are. They really trust what they're doing and what they're creating, their capacity to be able to take care of themselves, and then in turn, maybe to be able to provide and take care of someone else. And so they lack this anchoring and this sort of independent rooting in their own body. And so the fantasy is being used to recreate something, right? So relational fantasy is being used to recreate some longing inside of ourselves, right? So we're prone to this relational fantasy because we're trying to recreate some situation where we can ultimately receive love at some level that we never received, at least not consistently. And this is what both men and women are doing, right? Both men and women, when we give in completely right away, we're like, oh my God, yes, I'm all committed, and we lack that inner discernment, it means that we are trying to recreate some situation or circumstance where we can receive the love that we never received, at least never received consistently, right? And so we're pulling from some place internally inside of us that hasn't been healed. And so that higher frequency, that addiction to like higher frequency up here. And when I say the addiction to higher frequency, this would be the same thing as love and sex addiction. We're addicted to this, the dopamine rush, the serotonin rush. We're addicted to the chase. We're addicted to the infatuation. We're addicted to the falling in love. We're addicted to the newness, the novelty. That's higher frequency, right? And really what that means is that, okay, guys, imagine like at your root is like a wound, right? Imagine that your root is a wound. And in order to like really heal in your own sort of energetic space, all by yourself, you're being asked to descend, to hit that root, and to really, really be with that root completely in your own energy without anyone's interference, right? You're being asked to really, really be with that root completely on your own. And it's uncomfortable, right? You have to sit in it and you work through it. And in that space, as you begin to work with the root, what it does is it brings up all your feelings of unworthiness, right? It brings up all your attachment fears. It brings up feelings of scarcity, right? It brings up every sort of uncomfortable feeling. And so typically what happens is when people come up to that root, rather than staying and working with the root, they move back up to the higher frequency, right? And so in terms of relationships, the best way to explain this example would be, say someone comes out of a relationship, maybe it was like a toxic relationship or like a really, really unhealthy relationship, and that person, spirit God, is like, you need to really, really be with the root of this. meaning the core of your side of the fence of what brought you into a relationship that was of this sort of creation, right? And so, and then you break up and a couple months go by and you kind of begin to start to feel a little bit of those pieces inside of you that were creating that relationship, right? Or that was participating to the co-creation from your side of that relationship. And you start to feel into that energy a little bit. You're like, ooh, it's a little bit uncomfortable. You're starting to feel aspects of yourself that don't feel so great, right? And you start to feel the unworthiness, the attachment in your body starts to come up, the scarcity, the longing. And then what happens is people begin to sort of feel into that root. And when I say that root is really what would create a foundation. If we move through that root, it would be like think of the root chakra, right? It would be it would really, really be cultivating that sort of foundation internally for us in our own sort of body and energetic sovereignty within ourselves. But instead of working through that, most people are like, whoo. And so that person that was in the unhealthy or toxic relationship a couple months prior gets back on a dating app, or they start looking for the next partner. And if you were in an unhealthy or toxic relationship and like 2 or 3 months later, you're all of a sudden like looking for another relationship, you 100% have not done any work in dealing with the root of what put you in that situation to begin with, right? And so most people go back to the higher frequency. And really what that means is they start to sort of scrape up to the internal material that was driving their relational choices and the relational containers in which they created. And it gets too uncomfortable to begin to sift through and feel that stuff in the body. And so it becomes a form of searching for relational dopamine, right? Relational serotonin, approval, validation, longing for connection, longing for belonging of some idea. And so rather than sitting and sifting through the material, we jump back up here, right? And relationally, just what that means is we don't really ever really descend through the core wound or the core root of material. And we move back into searching actually directly from the wound, right? We go back to searching directly from the wound or from the root, which we haven't descended into. And this is really where things like love addiction are created, right? Think of like love addiction would be, we're perpetually in sort of new situations and situations that are constantly like not really working out. We're like here and we're just continually in these really quick things that go fast and heavy, really, really quickly, really impulsively, really erratically, and don't really have legs to last long term. And what that really means is there's something foundational inside of us that we haven't cultivated, that we haven't descended into. And so now we're relating from like higher frequency energy. And what that means is that we're never going to feel whole in a relationship. We're actually going to outsource and outsource all desire for happiness, for wholeness, for desire, for approval, for validation to this partner. And this is obviously how things like codependency are created. I talk about a term a lot of the time called spiritual codependency. Spiritual codependency is, just to explain it to you guys, you know how in a relationship, the number one thing that we're looking for is spiritual liberation. The number one thing we're looking for relationally is spiritual liberation. We're looking for a spiritual experience, right? Think about if you're like a really emotional, deeply feeling woman, you want to move into a relationship and you want to have some type of spiritual experience. If you believe in love, you believe in spirituality. The same thing. The same thing. It's an elevated human experience. It allows us to seemingly sort of transcend the mundane of the human experience, right? And so that's what we're looking for spiritually. And so spiritual codependence is when we meet someone who we have a really charged spiritual connection with, but it's not able to root and ground in reality. This is a lot of like twin flames, past life lovers, someone who we have a lot of ancient or sort of generational karma with, someone we have a lot of karma with in our lineage. And we meet them and we have this amazing soul connection. It feels so familiar, but it feels very ethereal, right? It feels very higher dimensional without legs. And so this is spiritual codependence because we see this relationship as our salvation, as our spiritual liberation. And we move into this relationship and we basically, in a codependent way, identify with sort of God's liberation through this relationship in this person. We're like, I don't believe in God if it doesn't work out with this person. Like we see this relationship as our destiny. You know, we use words like this person is my destiny. And so it's coming from a real spiritual longing. And spiritual codependence is going to be really prone with people who are really, really spiritual or have a real interest in spirituality in that path, but also have a lot of deep wounding in the human body they haven't dealt with. So when we have a lot of deep wounding in the human body, and we're this really old and ancient soul who really desires to have a spiritual experience here on earth, and we meet a connection that feels like, oh my God, it's this higher dimensional sort of frequency. But we haven't dealt with, as a man, we haven't built the masculine foundation, right? And think of a man who doesn't have a masculine foundation. It's like you go into his space and you can't really like feel any establishment of his energy and how he set up his life, right? He's kind of floating. He's not like rooted and anchored in who he is and what he's about. And so we're prone to spiritual codependency when we haven't dealt with our deepest wounding, but then we find this connection and we're like, oh my God, this is my liberation. This is my spiritual salvation, right? And then typically what has to happen is that if we're really, really, truly meant to come into like an embodiment of God, that relationship typically doesn't work out. And it doesn't work out because what it's basically revealing, I should actually say what's more apt is if we're really meant to ground and earth God in the human physical body in a real three-dimensional way. Because you guys, a lot of people do live up here and they live up here their whole lives. A lot of spiritual people live up here their whole lives and they never really drop, right? And these are always the people who are looking for constant elevated spiritual experience. Like, you know, this type of community, right? People who are constantly addicted to like elevated spiritual experience, whether it's through like plant medicine or through addiction to like spiritual ceremony or what, like that whole world. The only type of spirituality they know is like an elevated, and that basically becomes like a form of like a higher frequency dopamine rush, right? When we're constantly addicted to that sort of elevated experience, right? And so there are people in the relational space who find that higher frequency relationship and it works for them because their contract in life is not to drop God into a three-dimensional experience. And what I mean by that is they're not really meant to be those types of people who really, really have a deep connection to God and the mundane or the earth. And so they have to live in that elevated space. But if we are someone who has a contract to really bring God to earth, which I talk a lot about, is what I feel is this new wave of people where we're really bringing God to the three-dimensional space through us. If that is our contract, then we probably will have to shatter our spiritual codependency, which means we probably will have some type of like potent soul, ethereal, spiritual connection, at least one that comes into our space where we kind of see it as our destiny, but really it's revealing the rose-colored glasses of our spirituality, the ways that our spirituality is actually wounded. And so that's what like a spiritually codependent relationship, what it does to us is it reveals through romantic relationship how our spirituality is actually a form of fantasy. It reveals how our spirituality is a form of fantasy. Which that's a really, really important point, you guys, because when I say our spirituality is a form of fantasy, think about most people who are addicted to elevated spiritual experience. which would be the type of people who do plant medicine every weekend, the type of people who are like so immersed in a spiritual sort of space, they can't really function in reality. They can't really function in the 3D. What happens now is that basically this relationship reveals the attachment trauma that we haven't healed. It reveals our wounds through this relationship, and it becomes some form of escape, right? And so if we're someone, even our own spirituality becomes a form of escape, that we have to like go somewhere to be spiritual, right? We have to like go to the ceremony. We have to go to the whatever, the fucking festival. We have to create an elevated experience to be spiritual. That's basically the revelation of spiritual codependence in terms of a romantic relationship, that we have to go somewhere else to have a spiritual experience. And so when this type of relationship doesn't work, when we actually rupture here, what it really is doing is it's beginning the process of really teaching us how to have a spiritual experience here on earth in the 3-dimensional. And it's also showing us that in order to really have a spiritual experience, that we have to actually ground our deepest human attachment trauma, our deepest sort of wounding that would lead to us yearning from our wounds for relationship as a form of fantasy, as a form of escape, right? And so now what happens if we rupture in that relationship? Now we begin the process of really having to deal with the root, really having to deal with the root. And we thought the ending of that relationship, oh my God, God is over. But we actually learn, okay, this is actually the beginning of God. This is but the beginning of God in a really grounded way, in a really embodied way. And as we learn to really ground God in the body, what begins to happen is it really shifts our relationship to relational fantasy. You guys get that? As we really ground God in the body, as we really begin to ground God in the body, and I mean ground God in the root chakra, it begins to shift our relationship to relational fantasy. And it's because really what it means, if I can really break this down really practically to you guys. And so I like this topic because this topic here that we're talking about, I'm talking about ethereal stuff, but we're talking about it in a very relational way. Like we're talking about this in a very practical, grounded way, which I think people have a hard time with this bridge is how, okay, I'm a spiritual person. I really have ethereal energy that I access, but how do I like really become how do I live in relational mastery here on earth? And so what I'm really talking about at the core here is our deepest unworthiness, your deepest feelings of unworthiness at your root. So the deepest feelings of unworthiness at our root is what drives sex addiction, love addiction, all these different forms of relational escapism. At some level that we don't feel worthy, right? And in terms of an attachment sense, what this means is that we're living within the fear-driven construction of unhealed attachment to mom and dad, right? So there was a real longing for some type of connection with mom and dad, but we're actually being constrained through the wounding of that unhealed attachment. And so as you begin to move through your deepest unworthiness, you're also simultaneously beginning to heal your deepest attachment, which is going to be the core fear that you hold around intimacy. Because really what our attachment trauma is doing is creating a threshold for intimacy. It's creating a threshold for intimacy. How much intimacy are we able to hold in our body is going to be determined by the amount of attachment trauma that we're still holding to mom and dad in our body. And so as you begin to deal with your deepest unworthiness, right? And think about it. Again, what I talk about, you guys, is that when we're dealing with our deepest unworthiness, and you guys will probably relate to this, think about yourself. in your own life or people that you've seen, we begin to kind of come up to our shit. And one of the number one ways that we avoid having to deal with our stuff is we either find a relationship or we start looking for a relationship or we start looking for sex or we start looking for or we start dating. Like we want some relational stimulation. We want some relational stimulation, right? And so think about how often even people come out of a relationship and they don't go to the root. They kind of begin to, because again, think about it. You go through a breakup, you guys, and I like to think of it like this. When you go through a breakup, there's two stories you're dealing with. You're dealing with this relationship, right? But you're also dealing with the older story that is being played through this relationship. So you're dealing with the hurt, the heartbreak, the betrayal potentially, the grief from here, but you're also going to be dealing with another older story because every single time we go through a rupture, it's leading to a revelation of an older story inside of us as well. So there's two stories that we're dealing with, right? Think about how seldom someone goes through a breakup and they deal with the older story, right? Because if you think about it, right, you go through a breakup, you experience grief. If you don't deal with the older story, you're probably the next relationship you find is probably going to be somewhere in the vicinity or the ballpark of what you created before, right? And unless that person or that relationship was really fucking close to what you wanted, if it was really far removed to what you wanted, then it means that there's a really, really old story that was still driving the boat. And think about how seldom people deal with that older story. Most people aren't even aware of that. I mean, that's why people go to therapy. But like most people aren't even aware of that older story, right? And so that older story is essentially, think about that relationship that didn't work out was a symptom. It was a symptom of some root cause, right? And think about, and what happens with people is anytime we go through a breakup, it becomes an opportunity to deal with a root cause, right? To deal with the root cause. And typically what happens is people come up, we kind of brush up or we sort of skim up or we start to feel some element of that root cause and we're like, ooh. And this portal that happened September, October, November that we're still coming out of was revealing a lot of root cause. It was revealing a lot of root cause, which is why this portal was so relational in the sense it was like really revealing ways that we dated. And the way I could describe this, you guys, is like a wound projection. So when we're someone who's prone to relational delusion or relational fantasy, it means we live in a wound projection. Ultimately, it's a form of like, it's actually like a lack of relational shadow work, right? So we actually, a wound projection is we're actually dating and relating from a really unintegrated relational shadow. And we're moving out into the world and the space of like dating and shit, spearheaded from that place. What happens when we do that is we're going to create some relationship that's going to be from unhealed attachment, meaning attachment's going to be really strong. I'm curious, you guys, have you guys ever like gone through a breakup or a relationship that ended and like you really, really felt, oh, what I'm feeling, I can tell this is a lot more about my attachment than it was about that actual person, because I've experienced that actually multiple times where I was like, oh, okay, it was spirit revealing to me that you're actually trying to heal your attachment trauma. And so while you experience grief about this person, there was so much more loaded in the rupture and the separation. And you could literally feel your attachment so strong. And I went through this process where it was like my attachment was so on display. And as you're healing your attachment, you're also healing your deepest form of unworthiness. Attachment, the way that attachment shows up, you guys, is going to be like attachment trauma is going to be deep loneliness, isolation, confusion, really deep fear, feeling really lost. But it's also going to show up as deep, deep unworthiness, Robin W says, I see it in daily life and all my relationships, really. Yeah. And Robin, I'm curious, like, in seeing it in your daily life as attachment, like say attachment becomes illuminated, right? Do you feel that what's really being brought up is a combination of um, feeling unworthy, of fear, um, being lost, um, not really having an anchoring or a foundation inside of yourself, and feeling this sort of deep sense of unworthiness and self-loathing in that as a result, and not really knowing where we have to latch onto. And so we're really having this illuminated, deep, deep sense of unworthiness inside of ourselves that gets revealed through our human attachment, right? And you guys, the reason why I'm talking about all this, because when we talk about what makes us susceptible to a relational delusion or a relational fantasy, it's everything that I've been talking about. This is what makes us susceptible to anchoring, missing, yes, moving from my inner kid. Yes, completely, right? So when we're in the middle of experiencing our attachment, we're going to feel really young. We're going to feel really, really young. And we're basically, going to be relating through our inner child. We're going to be relating through our inner child. And just to let you guys know, most people, majority of the population doesn't deal with this stuff before they move into relationship, right? Most people don't deal with their deepest, I mean, and we also will really heal this in relationship, but most people don't really deal with these pieces. And I will say, because the majority of people don't really go on a path where this stuff gets accessed. But I will say that more and more people are going through these experiences right now. And I've heard this term posted by a lot of different practitioners where they say the future is relational, or the revolution is relational. And this is being spoken by a lot of like grounded in the earth practitioners. And I agree with this, because you know what it means? The revolution is relational. What it means is that our spirituality is not being compartmentalized to our human relational wounds and our human relational attachment. You guys understand that difference, right? So often, think about it, right? So often we have spirituality here and relationships here. Whereas when we say the revolution is relational, or the future is relational, what that really means is that an experience of God is actually going to be found through healing our human attachment and through working with our deepest forms of unworthiness, so that we're already living and existing in a really powerful spiritual experience through our own sort of human vessel here. This is what sacred union is, the future of sacred union. This is also a lot of what I talk about in my work is God becoming a relational experience. And so now we have a spiritual experience inside of ourselves. And what happens when you really cultivate an embodied, deeply grounded experience of God in your body? The charges of relational delusion and fantasy are not nearly as strong. Now, and you guys, what will happen when you really begin to heal your, let's say, things like sex addiction, love addiction, being prone to self-abandonment in relationships, or being prone to overstepping our own internal boundaries, or being really impulsive and erratic, and being really fast and impulsive relationally, or overly committing too quickly, or not honoring ourselves when someone comes in the picture who we like to connect with. What it really means as we begin to heal these charges of looking for a spiritual experience outside of ourselves, now what comes is discernment. Is we can live in reality, right? So when we talk about true love is love that is born from reality, love that is birthed from the reality of a connection. That's true love. right? And so in order to move into this vibration, we have to deal with the core root, the core wounding that drives wound projection, our relational shadow, that leads to us not being able to allow a situation to unfold. Because I think what we want to be able to do is get into a space relationally where we can be getting to know someone, and we can be in the early goings of relationship, and we can be deeply in just an unfolding where we're just so present in the unfolding that we're not futurescaping and future planning. Um, and we're really, really able to just live totally, totally in reality. And so, what that's going to come down to is how much attachment trauma that we've healed, how much of that deep core unworthiness that we've worked with. And we're going to feel really discerning. We're going to feel really, really discerning. And what it's going to feel like energetically is you have more of a foundation inside of yourself. You have more of a foundation inside of yourself. So people who are prone to relational fantasy, they don't have an internal foundation, right? And this is like what codependency is, right? Is that we look at this relationship essentially as like a co-regulation of our foundation, that we don't feel anchored in the world, and so we kind of need this relationship to allow ourselves to feel like we have some semblance of a foundation, right? Think about the amount of people that like stay in relationships because like not having that relationship, like they don't even know if they could survive. Like think about the amount of people that are in relationship, and you probably know couples like that. Like if they weren't together, like neither, like both, like there's so many couples where like I just know would never get divorced because they're literally their own. It's gotten to the point where individually for both people, their own fucking survival is dependent on them being together like that. And so that's what happens. And that's because we don't have an internal foundation inside of ourselves and how we relate and connect to the world, right? When that's the case, we're not able to vet or discern a relationship properly, right? What it does is it creates relationships where we choose the wrong person to begin with. It creates relationships where you don't ask the hard questions. You don't have a healthy degree of conflict. You try to make sure everything's okay. You self-abandon, you self-sabotage constantly. Resentment creeps into the relationship because there's aspects, right? There's projections that are happening that are being pulled from our own sort of survival, right? And again, it all comes down to safety and our safety in the world. And if we don't feel safe in the world, right, relationships is going to be that the most elusive and illuminating and shining place that we will look for, that co-regulation, for that place where not only we can be okay, but we can have an elevated experience. We can have an elevated experience. And so all of this, all of these pieces are what contribute to being prone to relational delusions. You know what I mean? Where we're vetting someone and we're not asking really important questions that are really important for us in alignment, or we're ignoring red flags. We're like, like we're letting sort of shit slide. And we're not really taking in the entire scope, right? You know, the whole idea we have our rose colored glasses on, or we're living in delusion, or we're living in illusion. And we're not able to just really, really allow a situation to unfold and really live in reality, right? And what that means somatically is that you're really, really in your root. And you've actually dealt with your deepest trauma and your core wounds that live at your root. So you can actually ground God in your body at your root. So now, you guys, this is important. And we're kind of getting to the end here. Love addiction is using relationship as a projected spiritual experience. Love addiction is using relationship as a projected spiritual experience. It's essentially what it is love addiction is we're looking for an elevated dopamine experience. That's what we're doing, right? And what that means is that there's some element of salvation that we're looking for. And when we actually begin to find that salvation internally, we begin to create an embodied God experience inside of ourselves through our core wounds, through our attachment. Now we don't look for this charge, right? It's like as we're dating, relating, we're like, oh, shit really feels different, right? And it doesn't feel like a dopamine rush experience, because what happens when we're really prone to live in love addiction or push pull relationships, what we're actually addicted to is a dopamine experience. And think about it, like a dopamine experience is really like this. It's like a roller coaster. We're really searching an elevated experience, right? Like think like love addiction, like think about it like we're looking for a charge, we're looking for a buzz, right? In the same way an addict is looking to get high. We're looking for a hit. We're looking for an elevated experience. And so you'll actually really notice that your relational fantasy and your relational delusions are beginning to heal when you don't feel these dopamine rushes as you're relating. You're almost kind of scarily neutral. And what it feels like, and the reason why I'm talking about this, because this is something that I've like healed in myself and had to deal with at like a really fucking deep level. And you move into like a scary place of neutrality. And at first you're like, what the fuck is like, this is different. And at first, like, you kind of don't like it, right? At first you're like, this is like really different. Like, and so you're actually having to learn love is a new vibration. It's kind of like, rather than love being like cocaine, right? Or like an elevated experience, you're looking for something that's a perpetual like shimmering growth. That's kind of like this, as opposed to like, right? It takes on a different sort of vibration. And what you'll notice is that you just feel more rooted and in your foundation, even with this connection here. Like, you won't do things to appease the relationship. And actually the idea, and say you're getting to know someone, the idea of it getting to a point where it's like, yeah, we're not in alignment, like that feels like really okay for you in your body and system, because you've gone through enough ruptures relationally and through attachment that you've already like scraped out that experience in your body. And so now you're not looking for this higher frequency escape. You're actually like dating and relating from a fully embodied experience. So you guys, if you want to like think about what is sacred union, what it means is that God is fully embodied through your entire form at a cellular level. And you actually have a level of discernment of God in your body all the way through your body at an entire cellular level, that you're dating and relating from the full embodiment of who you are. What typically happens in relational delusion and fantasy, we're vetting from a lack of foundation, from a projection from our core unworthiness and an elevated higher frequency escape. We're vetting from this place. And so now what we're going to search is some match vibrationally. Someone else who's also similarly wounded, who's looking for another high vibrational escape. And now we kind of lock on. This is where things like trauma bonds are created, and or twin flames, shit like this. We're looking for a higher vibrational match, and we move irregardless of like the lower frequency, the mundane, the practicality, the structure, the rootedness. We date irregardless. This is where like twin flames are created, trauma bonds, really ethereal connections, where spiritual codependency, because it's trying to rupture up here so we can drop. It's trying to rupture up here so we can drop. And so we find a vibrational match of someone else where we can go fast and furious with, where we can live in another projection. And now, and these are the types of connections that are like, I mean, a classic example would be like Ben and J-Lo. You know what I mean? And they just got married and shit. But so we're looking for this higher vibrational match. But these are these connections that are really hot and they kind of like fizzle out, or there's like a honeymoon period, and then it's like, oh, like what? And it's because we were looking for that higher vibrational match and escape. And so we want to think of like discernment is vetting through your entire body. As a woman, discernment would be vetting through the deepest recesses of your womb. As a man, it'd be doing through the deepest recesses of the integration of your cock and your root and your pelvis and your pelvic floor. So the way that we're discerning is through our entire body. It's through our entire form, right? That's where discernment is. And that's where we really, really heal the being prone or susceptible to relational delusion or fantasy. Again, relational delusion, fantasy, pretty interchangeable. What it basically means is that we're prone to a higher frequency dopamine rush. And that's what our body and our nervous system is addicted to or searching for. And so typically what we're looking for is some elevated experience of when we were really young. So think about it. What we're looking for is some experience of when we really felt in love with our parents. That's actually what we're looking for, is some elevated dopamine rush of those fleeting moments of intimacy and connection we felt with mom and dad. If it was few and far between or really inconsistent, we're looking for we're looking for an experience of that. Or if we never experienced an imagination of what that might be. That's what we're actually searching for. That's what we're seeking, recreating, and playing out. And so typically, right, if we never receive that or is really inconsistent, then what happens is the recreation of the relationship gets mirrored in a similar frequency of the inconsistency or the trauma or the abuse that we might have experienced when we were young. Right? If we like think about people prone to narcissism, you know what I mean? The hook is that like a narcissist can be really charming and magnetic. It could be someone that's really off and on. And so the hook that we get hooked into is when the narcissist or the parent, because if we're prone to narcissism, we usually had a parent who was a narcissist, and we're prone to the elevated experience of feeling desired or wanted and being hooked in from that parent, or being loved from that parent, or experiencing the charming or magnetism from that parent, right? And then we move into a recreation of like, oh, when the bottom falls out, right? Or when we get abandoned or whatever it might be, right? So the dopamine rush is we're looking for a recreation of the elevated experience of when we were young, or the elevated experience that replicated what we desired, or at least what we imagined it would be like to receive what we desired. And so that's what happens. We're being drawn here, and all this is here that hasn't been dealt with. And so when we drop to the core root, we're dealing with what fuels that higher frequency charge. And when we deal with what fuels that higher frequency charge, that's when the vibration of how we love and relate changes. More discernment, stronger boundaries. We have more of a foundation. We have a stronger container. We feel more anchored in the world. We heal our attachment. And now we're not looking for a relationship dopamine rush. We're looking for like a full embodied union where a strong spiritual connection and soul connection is really mirrored with like pillars of practicality and discernment and a foundation. And what we can actually do is, and I'll say this, guys, that like we're discerning and vetting through a replication of our own embodiment, right? And so if we're in a ton of relational fantasies, it means there's something that hasn't been embodied within us in terms of our connection to God at a real relational human level. And when we really do ground and heal our relationship to God in a really relational human level, that charge that we feel, that dopamine rush, it begins to dissolve and dissipate. And now we actually crave a different vibration of love, where it's sort of like an organic unfolding, where it's like a discerning process of openness, where it's a discovery process, like a loving discovery. And it shifts, right? And we move into a whole different vibration. And this is where people can be a little confused, because they're like, okay, I don't feel those dopamine rushes like I used to. And when we're like someone prone to love addiction, we're gonna seek, or we haven't healed, we're gonna seek dopamine rushes, right? We're gonna seek really, really elevated experiences. We're gonna be drawn to the really, really elevated experience. And we're not gonna be able to like vet for like healthy, discerned, embodied love. And so when that really heals and integrates, then now we're pulling from all of ourselves, and we don't just seek that un unfulfilling dopamine rush that we would have in the past, that we're pulling from a deeper thread and a deeper cord, a more sovereign cord and thread, and in a more deeply embodied, secure, and safe foundation inside of ourselves internally. Robin W says people only hang in and prefer lower frequency. Also, recreation of childhood ancestor story. Does it release a hormone too? Yeah. So Robin's talking about like, for example, like what would be the opposite of like love addiction? Like over practicality, right? Um, think about like a couple that um, they met when they were young, and like this is good enough, or this is like secure and stable, and they didn't even and it's basically it's a connection that lacks passion, right? If you think about like if we're someone who's prone to things like love addiction, we're not the relationships that we're coming into are in a surplus of passion. Probably the problem is finding a connection where it's like we're able to like move through the world day in and day out in a healthy way where we can support each other's growth and healing, um, versus like these overly practical relationships. um, they're probably lacking passion. You know what I mean? Both people probably pretty shut down. Um, maybe we don't have that much fun together. And so it becomes so much more about um, like, does this work? Right. So it's the complete avoidance, feels dead, not transformative. Yeah. So like, yeah, like lower frequencies, like this is stable, this works, this is good enough. It works in the practical realm. And so, relationships would be more lower frequency, would really work in the practical human realm, but they probably don't have any sort of spiritual experience. And like, you can even go as far as like, you know, where would that come from? Right? Why would we be in a space where we look for a lower frequency relationship? And I'll actually connect this um, for Robin's question. I'll connect this to like, if we're in lower frequency relationships and we connect this to our relationship to spirit or spirituality. For example, maybe we grew up in a home that was Catholic, and we had this experience, this really sort of stringent, obedient version of spirituality that was indoctrinated through religion, right? That is really going to potentially affect our relationship to spirituality and relationships. Or if we grew up in a home where we had to be overly obedient, what can sometimes happen in really like authoritative homes, you guys, where we had like a really domineering caregivers, they can actually become the exemplification of God. And so it actually desensitizes our relationship to spirituality, because the parent perceived themselves as God or as an authority figure. And so we actually lose a connection to spirit and spirituality because of the domineering parent or caregiver. Like, think about if you had like a dad or a mom that was like, you had to be overly obedient to like fit within. That can really impact our relationship to spirit. So if we live in like models of like having to be overly obedient, right, that can really move us into these realm of practicality, stability, where things like crown chakra are really fucking shut down. Higher frequency energy is really, really shut down and basically conditioned out of us. And so all these to pose as possibilities why we might be someone who's prone to relationships that are more conservative, that lack passion. Whereas if we're someone who, was able to sort of dream and free to sort of express ourselves, this on the other end of the spectrum, right? But we lacked and I think I've talked about these different parenting styles. But that love addiction is looking for that dopamine rush um, of that hit, right? And like think about like love addiction, we're always prone to. It's not even like love addiction. It's like we're prone to the chase. We're addicted to falling in love, but we don't really like what happens once you've already fallen in love, and then now you're moving through day in day out, right? So it's really we're addicted to the chase. We're addicted to novelty. We're addicted to the newness of something. And we're not really able to exist with love in the mundane. And that really is, we're searching for an elevated experience, right? Which is through some projection of something, right? Um, yeah, so that's interesting. What else? Relationship is for safety and security rather than healing. Yeah, well, it's like um an important question, and I don't know if you guys might relate to this, is like some couples who you can tell their purpose of being together is to have children, and their relationship is not really passionate. They're not really meant to like heal with one another, but they were kind of meant to come together and just have kids. And you see couples like that, and the life becomes about the kids. Um, about and I know couples like that. And then there's other couples where the purpose is to start a business together, to go into business together. And so that becomes more about you could call that, I would call that a legacy relationship, um, where they're about, you know, being high status in the community. They're about, she supports him in his career, and maybe she even works in the business, but it's all about just the legacy of what they create together. And then the most common relationship are growth oriented relationships where we want to grow and we want to heal together. That's definitely and then another type of relationship would be um I don't know. There is a name for it, guys, and this is not something I'm coming up with right now. This is I'm paraphrasing from some teachings. Would be like a security or a safe relationship, which is a relationship that's kind of relationships that are used for a sense of comfort. That are it would be I think it's called a companionship. So like a companionship model would be like a relationship where you don't fucking have crazy sex, you don't have crazy passion, you don't really care about growing together, but you enjoy being together. It's more of like sort of a friendship, right? It's more of a you get along well. So a companionship model is also more of like a friendship. A legacy model is like all about you could be going into business together. Creating kids and giving birth to kids is another model. And then a growth orientated relationship is another model. I think it's really important to establish what type of relationship you want, but think about how difficult or how seldom someone would be open about, I don't care about growing. I want just a companion. I guess some people are like that, right? That I want a companion. I don't care if we have really fucking hot sex. I don't even care if we have sex. I just want someone sleeping in the bed next to me, right? If you think about, though, a companionship model is really spearheaded by attachment, right? Spearheaded by a fear of loneliness, spearheaded by attachment. But then you can meet some people, it's like, I really just want to be a parent, right? And some relationships come together, and the purpose of them being together is that they're meant to just be parents together. And maybe they stay married, right? But the purpose, and this is what happens to a lot of couples when they get to a point and they just sort of have kids because they think they're meant to have kids, and then their relational focus becomes about having children, and eventually they move. But most people do this unconsciously, right? That's why you need to be really honest about what type of relationship you have. If you're in the spiritual space or the growth space, clearly you want a growth orientated relationship, which is the most common type of relationship. But you'd be surprised out in the world how many people don't want to grow, right? And that's actually not the style of relationship they want. But a growth oriented relationship is what we're talking about here. And when I refer to relationships and the orchestration of relationships, I'm always speaking from a growth oriented relationship style. But not everyone is meant to be in that style. And a lot of it has to do with our soul's contract and what we're here to do, right? And it's important to be really, really honest with that. And the blanket of shame muffling the higher frequencies, addicted to the peak experience. Yes. So 100%. And Robin, you asked it what hormone would be present in lower chakra. I'm not sure what. I think it'd probably be like a lack. It'd be like a lack of fucking dopamine. Like they probably need more dopamine in their space. Um, they need more of they need more excitement. And a lot of these people are probably people in the lower chakra relationship are probably afraid to be in joy. They're probably afraid to be expression. So probably being in any form of like, peak experience was shunned or was shamed. And so basically what they did was they built like an attachment style. And I think you might have mentioned this. I think you mentioned avoidance. And yes, because like avoidant, for example, anxious and avoidant attachments both experience similar forms of anxiety, but the anxious attachment usually experiences the anxiety externally, while the avoidant typically experiences it internally. So, Robin, you were talking about what's the hormone present, lower chakra relationship. Can there be a connection to avoidant? I would for sure say that, because there's a shutdown and there's a suppression that is happening in their system, where at some point they realize that their needs were never going to be met, and so they internalize their experience. On top of that, don't be too big, don't be too loud, don't be in too much joy, don't be in too much elevation, and so we contracted and we shut down in our system. And our attachment, because think about, guys, our attachment is being formed around this. And so for these people that really internalize their experience, their attachment was really formed in this internal emotional suppression, that it's not safe to expose too much, to reveal too much, that if I truly reveal what's going on or what I'm feeling, then that's actually going to be a threat, because then I'm actually going to reveal the moment of impact or severing when that need wasn't met. And so avoidant people of avoidant attachments have a fuck ton of anxiety, but it's really internal. It's really internalized. And so for them, it's not going to be safe to be in an elevated experience. And so, I think there's a lot of truth in that. So, interesting fucking shit, eh? Here we go. All right, everyone. If there aren't any more questions, I think we're going to begin to wind her down. If you guys have any more questions, feel free to put them in the chat. But yeah, we were talking about ending relational delusions and relational fantasy. So if there are any more questions, feel free to put them in the chat. Otherwise, this will be everything for today. Well, thanks for your questions and your interaction, Robin. Appreciate it as always. Sending love to everybody. Hope you guys are going to have a good week ahead. First week of December. If you guys enjoyed this video, please give it a thumbs up or share with a friend who might resonate or relate to it. And if you guys haven't already, as always, I would love for you to subscribe to my channel so you can be a part of this little community here. All right. I think that's it, everyone. Thanks for tuning into this live on Love the Frame of Growth-Oriented Relationships. Yes. How important is that? It's something we don't even think about. So just to reiterate what Robin was talking about, I love the frame of growth-oriented relationships. I've been describing it as my standard of relating. And the samples I used was a legacy relationship. And to a legacy relationship style, you guys, again, will have two functions. So a legacy relationship style could also be having children, right? Because you think about a legacy is to have kids, have offspring, or it could be, and this is probably a bit more of like a micro niche, but like couples who are like business partners or couples who create business together, and that the main focus of the relationship is like building an empire. A growth-oriented relationship, you want to build an empire, but you want a polarity, you want a passion, you want a hot sex, all this different shit. But in like a legacy relationship, purpose to have kids or build a business together, companionship model, you just more of a bit more of like a partner or a friendship. And then a growth-oriented relationship style, which is most people who would be tuning into these videos where you want someone ultimately that you can grow and heal with. You want someone who could heal your childhood wounds and childhood trauma with, your childhood attachment patterns. And you want to move into this elevated spiritual experience that is fully grounded on earth. So yeah, I really like those frameworks too. I try to be in a legacy orientated. I tried to be in a legacy oriented and it didn't work. Yeah. And that's the thing, right? Is like most people need to be like really, and most people like, think about the amount of people that are in say a companionship model relationship or a legacy model relationship, meaning like the focus of the relationship is co-parenting. And the amount of people who are in those relationship styles unconsciously, meaning the relationship didn't start out that way, but that's sort of, and this is what happens, guys, when you don't do the work in your relationship, you don't have the hard conversations, ask the hard questions, you don't have a healthy amount of conflict. And actually, when you have a lot of unhealed attachment trauma and a lot of fear, and you can't be direct, right? So you don't really ask the hard questions or move into that relational growth work. And so many people are in legacy and companionship model relationships unconsciously. Whereas like, think about the power if they're like, okay, I want a companionship model. Like, I don't care to grow in this relationship. But the amount of times, say, the man is like kind of existing in a companionship model, but the woman craves a growth oriented relationship, right? Think about how often that's playing unconsciously. And that's so much of resentment is you need to know. And I remember doing this work in one of my relationships from a few years past. What we did at the beginning and what we talked a lot about was defining what kind of the mission statement of your relationship was. And so it's kind of asking yourself the question, and I think this is a good question for any couple to ask themselves: why are we together? What is the purpose of us being together? Right? And in a growth orientated relationship, your mission statement will probably have a lot in it, right? It'll be like, we're going to heal our trauma together. We're going to co-create a kingdom together, step into our wildest dreams and become the embodiment of God, or whatever it might mean, right? Whereas the amount of people that if you ask them, what's the purpose of you being together, the amount of people who would not know how to answer that, the amount of couples that, and so what's really, really important and think about a couple, even if you have kids, and if the first thing you say is to have kids, that's actually revealing a lot about the unconscious threads of your relationship, right? Say if you ask a couple and without telling them these styles of relationship, what's the purpose of you and your wife being together? And they're like, oh, we have two beautiful kids. Immediately, they're in some legacy container, whether that's actually what they consciously want or not. And that's really interesting. And so that's so much of how people live out of relational alignment, right? Either what it means is you're not with the right person, or you and that person have not done the necessary relational work to create the container that you actually desire. Does that make sense? Because I think that's really fucking potent. And maybe you can ask one of your buddies or one of your girlfriends, not maybe when they're with their partner, but say you're out with your girlfriend for dinner. What's the purpose of you and so being together? And see what they say, because a lot of what they reveal will reveal what type of container they have created, whether that's conscious or not, right? And like a companionship model relationship probably won't even know how to answer it. We'll be like I enjoy being with them. You know what I mean? I enjoy I enjoy Like a companionship model relationship is like you say, I enjoy being with them. I enjoy being around them. Like, and that is kind of that companionship model where it's like you want to have a partner, right? But the thing is, even in a growth oriented relationship, you need that element where I just like being around them. But that wouldn't be the first thing that you say. That wouldn't be the first thing you say. But at the heart of every great romantic relationship is a great friendship. That is true. So I really like those frameworks too. I forget whose work that is. Again, I didn't just, I'm paraphrasing from someone else, but I forget who it was. It was years ago that I read that stuff and it just came back up. My voice. Okay, sweet, you guys. If you guys have any questions or anything, feel free to, you can drop them in as comments or you can DM me directly with any questions, anything that you want me to clarify or to focus in on for the next live of anything I discussed today. I'm more than happy to do that. That we can jam on for the next live. Or we both like to travel. Yeah, you're in a companionship model. But like, I mean, the amount of like, I think of my parents' friends, older couples who are in companionship models is like, particularly of not my generation, but the generation like my parents' generation. Majority of those relationships, I would say, are companionship model relationships. Combination of that and legacy model. I think growth oriented relationship models is something that's really big in our generation. It's the whole thing where our generation says, I want my own business. Now we want a relationship that has everything, which is amazing because that's why we're changing the fucking game. Because we're not just going to we don't just want a relationship to have kids and have someone to travel. We want fucking everything, right? Which is amazing. That's why we're disruptors. Sweet, everyone. Wish you guys a great week, you guys. And we'll see you on the next live on Friday. And again, don't hesitate to reach out if you have any questions about anything that you'd love for me to jam on or talk about more in future lives. All right, everybody. Be well.